Well, I'll bet that got your attention.
In June of 1992, delegates from all over the world met in Rio de Janeiro to continue the perpetuation of one of the greatest hoaxes in history. 99% of the people in the world are living in fantasy land. I've been lecturing for years that there is no depletion of the ozone, there is no ozone layer, and what have been called holes in the ozone layer are nothing more than natural occurrences that occur always in the same place every winter, depending upon which pole is experiencing winter at that particular time.
These hoaxes are intended to help impose austerity during the present economic collapse by shutting down industry and infrastructure and by attacking and destroying science itself. Last year, folks, the National Geographic Society released in book form the results of a Gallup poll of 10,000 individuals internationally testing their knowledge of geography. The National Geographic Society considers it, quite correctly, a mark of illiteracy that 56% of American respondents do not know the population of the United States. 32% cannot name any of the members of NATO, and 50% cannot name any members of the Warsaw Pact. But not to worry. Most Americans, 84%, are aware of concerns that fluorocarbons and other chemicals may be destroying the Earth's ozone layer. Oh my God. Among those that are aware, almost all, 94%, realize that the impact of a depleted ozone layer would be felt all over the world. Nearly 3 in 4, or 73% of all respondents, knew that wind patterns, and not the ozone layer, ocean currents or sunspots spread the fallout from the nuclear accidents at Chernobyl. As the Soviets have emphasized as part of their glasnost disinformation campaign, we in the free world must no longer see them through the lenses of an enemy image. Quote, "The new enemy is us. International economic security is inconceivable unless related not only to disarmament, but also to the elimination of the threat to the world's environment," unquote, said Mikhail Gorbachev to the United Nations General Assembly on December the 7th, 1988. Quote, "Time is running out. Much is being done in various countries. Here again, I would just like to underscore most emphatically the prospects opening up in the process of disarmament, particularly, of course, nuclear disarmament, for environmental revival," unquote. Scam 1, the holes in the ozone layer. The surface of this planet is covered by dry bits called land and big wet bits called water. Where these two bodies meet is termed a beach, which may be sandy, rocky, cliff face, or any one of many other types. And where these beaches occur, there is to a greater or lesser extent a certain amount of wave activity called surf. Remember Annette Funicello, Frankie Avalon, beach, blanket, bingo, surf? Guess that tells you how old I am, doesn't it? Well, imagine that you are strolling along a beach somewhere, minding your own business, and enjoying the view, when out of nowhere comes a demented Donald Francis III, hysterical, screaming, who wants to enlist your help in freeing the beach of board riders because they are wearing down the surf. He goes on to earnestly explain that the thin line of surf is the only thing holding back the ocean, and if the board riders wear it out enough, the layer of surf will become so depleted that it can no longer hold back the ocean, and the ocean will flood over the land and destroy mankind. What would be your reaction to such a person? Well, I think you'd quite possibly conclude, and quite correctly,
that Donald Francis III should be confined to the local funny farm as quickly as possible.
Wouldn't you? I should say at this point that most of this information on this program comes from the Executive Intelligence Report dated October 27th, 1989. Now, I've been lecturing for years that there is no ozone depletion, that there is no ozone layer, and that there is no danger from being fried by ultraviolet light rays. The reason that more people are getting skin cancer from exposure to the sun is because more people are out in the sun. It's a matter of demographics, population. Well, this is exactly the kind of logic being used to support the hole in the ozone layer scam, and erstwhile intelligent people are running around with varying versions of this Chicken Little story that the sky is falling. The sky is falling! The sky is falling! The ozone is being depleted! Oh my God! We must seek help! Without ever making even the slightest attempt to find out what is really happening and why. And you know, you all learned about this stuff in junior high school. As with the greenhouse effect, it is only necessary to understand a few very simple scientific facts to totally understand and debunk this scam. First of all, what exactly is the ozone layer? Our ozone mantle, as it is now being called, which supposedly protects us from all that unwanted ultraviolet light. Well, quite simply and bluntly, there isn't one. Just as the surf is not a magical barrier to the ocean flooding the land, and is, in reality, simply an effect of where land and water meet, so too is the so-called ozone layer. It's merely an area where an effect can be detected, not a cause. So let's start with a very basic chemistry lesson, which again can be confirmed with any junior high school textbooks. First of all, now listen carefully. This is very basic. I know a lot of you didn't take chemistry, but this is really easy to understand, so just relax, open your ears, close your eyes, sit back and listen. First of all, existing on this planet Earth and probably elsewhere is an element called oxygen. According to my dictionary, oxygen is an element with the chemical symbol O. Now, oxygen, for reasons I won't go into here, but which you can readily find out for yourself from the aforementioned junior high school chemistry book, rarely, if ever, exists as the single atom O. Such a single atom of oxygen, or most other elements, is called an ion. And it is very difficult for most substances to exist freely in their ionic state. So what normally happens is that two of these atoms of O seek each other out, combine or stick together and form the molecule O2. That means a molecule formed by two atoms of oxygen. And this is the oxygen as you and I know it. This is the stuff you and I and all other living creatures breathe in and expel. And what we expel after we've breathed it in and used it is carbon dioxide, or CO2, which is one carbon atom and two oxygen atoms. In other words, it's oxidized carbon. In yet another of nature's wonderful balancing acts, green plants breathe in the CO2, extract the atom of carbon, C, as a building block in their cellular growth and expel oxygen, or O2. Now this is why it's so important that we stop destroying all the green stuff on the land by overclearing and stop polluting up the oceans and thereby killing all the little green plants known as plankton. Because most of the oxygen that we breathe comes from these trees and this plankton. O2, or two oxygen atoms stuck together, if you like, is the normal or most prevalent form of oxygen in the atmosphere. But it's not the only one. If one applies various forms of energy to the O2 molecule, it will break down to its ionic state and reform into another configuration, one where 3, not 2 atoms of oxygen stick together to form a new molecule. And this new molecule is called O3, or ozone. Remember, O3, ozone. Now, the energy required to perform this little trick can come from quite a few different sources. An electrical discharge through the air will do it, and is probably one of the most common forms that you will recognize. Unlike oxygen O2, which is odorless, ozone has a distinct pungent smell. That's what you smell after a thunderstorm. Remember, you walk out after lightning strikes somewhere, or there's been a lot of lightning in the atmosphere, and you can smell that peculiar smell that smells kind of nice, actually. That's ozone. Now, if you've never smelled that, go around your house somewhere and pick up your kid's electric train engine or radio-controlled car after it's been operating for a while, and you'll smell this odor. That's because the electrical discharge where the bushes run on the motor turns a certain amount of oxygen, O2, into ozone, O3. Electrical storms, or at least the subsequent bolts of lightning, ionize a great deal of the surrounding air and create a certain amount of ozone. But folks, listen to this now. It's going to make you feel a little bit silly when you find out what the biggest source of energy for the conversion of oxygen O2 into ozone O3 is. It's the sun, or the energy from the sun, in the form of ultraviolet light. Now, if you're really intelligent and you're really smart, you already know what I said, don't you? Check this out. They're saying that the ozone layer is being depleted. And it's being depleted. Ultraviolet light is coming through the atmosphere, striking our skin and causing us to die. You understand what I'm saying? But it can't be happening, folks, because the biggest source of ozone in the atmosphere is from ultraviolet light. Ozone doesn't protect us from ultraviolet light. Ozone is formed from ultraviolet light. Do you understand what I'm saying? Ultraviolet light cannot come through the atmosphere without striking molecules of oxygen, and when it does, it forms ozone, and the ultraviolet light is depleted by this chemical reaction. Do you understand? Ozone is not protecting us from ultraviolet light. No. Oxygen protects us from ultraviolet light by depleting the ultraviolet light when the ultraviolet light strikes the molecule of oxygen and turns it into ozone. What happens is a cycle something like this. You and I breathe in oxygen, called O2, and breathe out CO2, carbon dioxide. Plants, on the other hand, breathe in carbon dioxide and expel oxygen. The cycle is more or less endless. And as long as there's oxygen in the atmosphere, we're okay. And you know what? I measured the percentage of oxygen in the atmosphere. It's exactly the same as there was 80 years ago. 80 years ago. How about that? I also measured CO2. It's the same also. Now, if you measure these near cities, then you get radical readings. But if you go way out in the country and measure the atmosphere, there's no difference than 80 years ago. And if you don't believe me, you can do it yourself. You can buy oxygen and CO2 analyzers from Beckman Instruments, and you can go out and measure it yourself. CO2 analyzers, oxygen analyzers. How do I know this? How do you think we measured the mixture of gases that we were making up for divers to dive with so that they would have the right mixture and it wouldn't kill them? You see, folks, you've really been fooled. Here's how it works. We have oxygen throughout the atmosphere. From the other direction, light from the sun streams in. A certain amount of this light is absorbed or deflected by various elements. atoms, molecules, and particles of other matter, dust in the air, whatever. The bulk of this light from the sun, however, continues its downward journey toward the planet's surface until it encounters the oxygen molecules. At the point where the sunlight reaches a sufficient concentration of oxygen molecules, a reaction takes place. A certain portion of the light from the sun, that portion known as the ultraviolet section, strikes the O2 molecules and imparts its energy to the oxygen molecule it has struck. This has two effects. First, it greatly reduces the amount of ultraviolet light which would otherwise reach the Earth's surface, because the ray, or unit, or beam of light, loses energy and becomes light in the lower spectrums, the ones we call colors. This is one of the causes of that spectacular light show called the Southern or Northern Lights, Aurora Borealis. Second, it converts the oxygen molecules, O2, into ozone molecules. Wake up. There's a portion of our atmosphere from 10 to 50 kilometers up which does not, however, get this name because it contains some magical, mysterious layer of matter known as ozone, which exists and has existed from the beginning of time to protect us from ultraviolet light, and which is now under dire threat from various man-made products. No. That is a crock of crap. It's a hoax. It's a lie. I like lie better because that's what it really is. It's a lie. It's called this name because this is the region where oxygen molecules are struck by incoming ultraviolet light and convert to O3, or ozone molecules, and it therefore has a slightly higher proportion of ozone molecules to oxygen molecules. Why only a slightly higher portion? Because remember, the atmosphere is constantly mixing. It doesn't stay there very long. And remember that ozone is a free radical. As soon as it strikes something that will oxidize, it reverts back to a molecule of oxygen, and the free radical forms with whatever was oxidized. Do you understand? There will continue to be an ozonosphere, and that's what it should be called. It's not an ozone layer, it's an ozonosphere, or as it is incorrectly termed, as ozone layer. There will always be this meeting of ultraviolet light and oxygen in the atmosphere, for as long as the planet's surface continues to manufacture oxygen to rise, and for as long as the sun continues to emit light to encounter that oxygen. You understand, we're in no danger from burning up from ultraviolet rays as long as oxygen exists in the atmosphere. It's not ozone that stops the ultraviolet light and protects us from this harmful light ray, this harmful energy from the sun. Ozone is a creation of the oxygen's protection of the earth from this harmful sun's energy. Oxygen is what does it, and oxygen is converted to ozone, which then lives only for a very short period of time because it's a free radical. How about that? That gets you a little angry? Don't shoot the messenger. Don't shoot the messenger. I'm just straightening you out here. You need to be straightened out. You see, this is no different than the meeting of the water and the land. And just as there will always be surf for as long as there are places where water meets land, there will always be ozone in places where ultraviolet light meets oxygen. The misnamed ozone layer will continue to simply be the end result of where two opposing forces and systems meet until such time as one or the other of those forces or systems just plain ceases to exist. Just as there will always be surf for as long as there is land and water, there will be an ozonosphere as long as there is oxygen and sunlight. Isn't that interesting? If either one of these packs up, we will have long since suffocated or frozen to death or something else, long before we develop skin cancer. As I said, this is stuff you can check out for yourself with the simplest of reference books. And if you hold up the statistics that say there's more people getting skin cancer now than there was 25 years ago, that's because there's more people on the beaches and out in the sun than there was 25 years ago. And if you don't believe me, check the statistics. It's true. And per capita, there's no more instances of skin cancer caused by the sun than there was per capita 25 years ago, or even 40 years ago. Except that the farther back you go, the more common it was to protect yourself from the sun and stay out of the sun. Sun tanning is a relatively modern phenomenon. It was not considered cool not too long ago. Let's look at some facts about the ozonosphere, as we'll call it. And you might say, okay, Bill, what about the so-called holes in the ozone layer? Well, as we have seen, there's no such thing as a magical, mysterious ozone layer, so there can't be any holes in it. However, there is a region called the ozonosphere, which normally has a higher incidence of O3, ozone, than O2, simply and purely because it is a region where a segment of sunlight or ultraviolet light strikes oxygen molecules and converts them into ozone molecules. Now, given the chemical, physical explanation of the ozonosphere as opposed to the hysterical version currently being peddled by the media and those who want to subvert the sovereignty of nations and give up control to take care of this imagined problem. It's not imagined, it's a purposeful lie. It becomes immensely easy to predict that there will be two holes in this said ozonosphere, or not holes. They're just places where this reaction does not take effect at certain times of the year. Now understand that the Earth is always tilted on this axis in relation to the sun. That's what causes us to have summers and winters. So you have to understand that at certain times of the year, as either the South Pole or the North Pole are closer or farther away from the sun, there is an area of the atmosphere directly above either the Arctic or the Antarctic where there is no meeting of oxygen and ultraviolet light. And you notice that these are the only places where they ever take photographs that show that there's no ozone in the atmosphere at that point. Actually, even though they show that there's none, there's always some. If lightning goes through the atmosphere, there's ozone. However, there's not as much as there would be if the sun, the ultraviolet light, were striking oxygen molecules at that point. Does everybody understand that? Gee, I sure hope you do, because I'd hate to start all over and explain this again. I hope you're taping this episode of the Hour of the Time, the only hour that ever was or ever will be or that ever is, the hour during which you will decide your future and thus our collective futures. As I have demonstrated, the so-called ozone layer requires for its very existence that oxygen molecules interact with incoming sunlight or ultraviolet light in order to create ozone molecules which can then be measured and referred to as the magical ozone mantle that protects us from ultraviolet light. Now, as you've already learned, that's a crock of crap, a lie, a blatant, purposeful lie. It's It's not accidental. It is a real, purposeful lie. Now, there are two places, and only two on the face of the planet, where for a portion of the year no ultraviolet light strikes oxygen molecules, and therefore where there can be no large formation of ozone molecules. Now, folks, I'm referring, of course, to the northern Arctic Circle in the northern hemisphere, winter, and to the southern Antarctic Circle as the southern hemisphere, winter. The Earth, thank God, is not positioned exactly perpendicular to the rays of the sun. If it was, the sun would be overhead in the same place all the time, and the so-called tropical regions would just get hotter and hotter until they became uninhabitable deserts, and the polar regions would just keep freezing. The bulk of the Earth's surface would either be too hot or too cold to live in, with only a thin region where the two extremities met, capable of supporting life as we know it. Fortunately, this is not the case. The Earth is, in fact, tilted over to one side with respect to the sun, and it is this tilt that gives us our seasons. Now, if you could see a picture of the Earth, you would be looking at a representation of the Earth at what is known as the northern hemisphere as the summer solstice. That is when the sun is directly overhead at the Tropic of Cancer. This is the height of the northern hemisphere summer. As you could clearly see if you had a diagram, no sunlight would be contacting the atmosphere above the Arctic Circle, and therefore there simply could not be any conversion of oxygen into ozone. Hence, there would be a measurable absence in the amount of ozone in the ozonosphere or in the atmosphere at that time.
Well, it's break time, folks. Don't go away. We'll be right back after this short pause. Welcome back, folks. Want to have some fun? Make copies of this tape and send it to your local environmental extremists. Now, environmentalism is good, but extremism and outright deception is bad. Make copies of this tape, send it to all of them, and watch them go down in flames.
As the sun's overhead position gradually changes and the sun moves back across the equator, the amount of sunlight reaching the Antarctic Circle gradually increases, thus giving rise to an increase in the incidence of ultraviolet light striking the atmosphere, thus causing this absence to again be filled with ozone. And the so-called hole to shrink. And the same thing would happen at the opposite pole when it went through its winter cycle. And surprise, surprise, there would be a measurable hole there in the amount of ozone in the ozonosphere. After the southern hemisphere solstice, the sun begins its journey northward again, and as we have in Australia slip into our autumn, the hole at the Antarctic Circle starts to grow again. But it's not really a hole. It's just an absence of ozone where the ultraviolet light is not striking oxygen in the atmosphere. And it's not coming down to the earth and burning any humans to a crisp either. You see, it's not happening. Just not happening. This is a natural cycle, ladies and gentlemen, which has existed and will continue to exist for as long as the earth is tilted, the atmosphere contains oxygen molecules, and ultraviolet light continues to come from the sun to convert them to ozone molecules. There are no laws that puny men can pass to stop this awesome forces and these cycles of nature, as King Canute learned when he attempted to order the tides to turn back. Laws to attempt to prevent the natural cycle of absence of ozone in the ozonosphere or in the atmosphere fall into the same category and should be treated with equal contempt. There's nothing you can do to change it. Do you hear me down in Rio de Janeiro? I know this broadcast gets there because this broadcast goes worldwide. Wake up. So where did all this nonsense about holes in the ozone layer come from anyway? Well, folks, back in 1985, the British climatological team in Antarctica discovered that at that particular time in the winter, there wasn't much ozone in the atmosphere at that point. And there was a relatively short bout of hysteria, as always, whipped up by complaint media because the whole thing was in somebody's interest. And that team was down there on purpose. They knew about this. They didn't have to go down there and figure it out. They already knew about it. This was purposefully done to create this hoax so that people would call for control. The only answer is one world government if you fall for the scam. And this was whipped up to bring that about. It was all front page hype and speculation about how half the world's population would be dead from skin cancer by the year 2000. And similar preposterous stuff. Now, if you think back to late 1985, early 1986, you should be able to remember it all. You should also be able to remember that it had all just died away by late 1986, early 1987, and you heard nothing more about holes in the ozone layer until quite recently. You know why? Well, I'll tell you. You knew I would, didn't you? It all died away because by that time the British scientists at the South Pole had been studying the phenomenon long enough to realize that it was not some hideous, dire threat to mankind's future, but part of a natural, endless, repetitive cycle. They always knew this. And this was actually reported in the papers by the scientists. But naturally enough, not in screaming page 1 headlines, but buried up on page 53 or somewhere back there, between the comics and the obituaries. What was also reported at the time was that the scientists who now knew exactly what they were dealing with were packing up in Antarctica and moving camp to the northern polar regions to test their own predictions that there would be a similar hole there at the opposite time of the year, thereby proving that the holes were not a new threat to the environment and to mankind, but part of a natural cycle. And that, of course, is exactly what they did, and that is exactly what they found. Of course, such a reassurance would not suit those who wish us to live our lives in a constant state of near panic, and therefore ever more prepared to hand over control of our lives to some form of Big Brother to save us. Remember Big Brother? We talked about him already. To save us from these imaginary threats. And so, rather than the papers correctly reporting that the British team had discovered a second hole above the Arctic Circle, a hole they had already predicted, and had gone there specifically to confirm, thereby proving their theory that such phenomena were part of a natural cycle, the papers instead screamed out from their front pages, "Second hole in ozone layer discovered, dire double threat to mankind." BS. And of course, they printed other similar hysterical drivel. And now, Margaret Thatcher, the head of government in Britain, the person who was ultimately responsible for the team that discovered the first hole, and the person ultimately responsible for sending the team to the Arctic Circle to substantiate their theories, the person with access to all this information, and the person who should have been leading the way in debunking the scam, was the person inviting scientists and leaders from all over the world to formulate policies and agreements, and if necessary, world laws, to be administered by the United States to tackle this new threat. And there are still people trying to convince us that she's one of the good guys. She was never one of the good guys. None of them are. Remember I told you, at the highest levels, they all belong to the same club. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not in favor of any strange laboratory-created substances polluting the air. I have to breathe too. And I wholeheartedly endorse the current campaign to rid the atmosphere of chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, the atoms being blamed for the so-called holes in the ozone layer, but they are not responsible for it. But just stop for a minute and think. If CFCs cause the so-called holes, why are they only over the polar regions? Are the polar explorers and scientists using too much hairspray or deodorant or fly killer? Of course not. If there was going to be an ozone hole anywhere that was caused by CFCs, it'd be directly above Los Angeles. Or Tokyo. Or London. If they had anything to do with it, they'd be over New York or Tokyo. The holes would be over the major cities, not over the poles. Or at least somewhere relative to these places where it could be shown that the air currents were causing the CFCs to accumulate, but they are not. You see, the holes only occur in two places, predictable, and they occur every winter, wherever the winter happens to be, over the north and south polar regions, exactly in accordance with natural forces which create the bulk of ozone, and exactly in accordance with the theories and predictions of the scientists who discovered them in the first place. And why is it that this program, The Hour of the Time, is the only place that you could ever hear this? Because there really is no such thing as freedom of speech, ladies and gentlemen, but that's the subject for another program. Think about something else for a moment. Imagine a can of fly spray, if you like. Think about a whole supermarket shelf of cans of fly spray, or even an entire supermarket full of nothing else but cans of fly spray. Picture in your mind how much CFCs are involved, and will find their way into the atmosphere to somehow, never actually explained, destroy ozone. Now picture in your mind a Boeing 747 jet with its four massive engines. Now imagine that jet hurtling through the sky at hundreds of miles an hour, scooping literally tons of air into its engines every minute or so. Now, what those jet engines are doing with that air is extracting the available oxygen, tons and tons of it, and using it to burn kerosene, thereby using up the oxygen and creating various carbonic gases. And where do these jets fly? Why, predominantly up where this meeting between ozone and ultraviolet light takes place, the place we called the ozonosphere. That's right, the oxygen these jets destroy by the ton every minute or so is not the O2 variety you and I breathe, it's the O3 variety which supposedly exists as some kind of protective mantle, and which we must now save at all costs, even at the sacrifice of democracy and freedom. Every time a jet takes off and flies somewhere, it destroys more ozone than you and I could even imagine, let alone use as CFCs in a lifetime. We're not talking amounts that can even be conceived in terms of fly spray cans or deodorant or hairspray. We're talking volumes of ozone similar to the amount of water in Sydney Harbor at any given time, and that's one Boeing 707 or 747 or any one that you want. Pick one. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of such flights occur all over the world each and every day, except in Australia at Christmas, when, as everybody knows, all the airline staff go on strike every year, right on schedule. But have you heard anybody suggest that jet flight be banned, or at least kept below the ozonosphere? No, of course not. Any more than you hear people calling for the banning of automobiles because they kill 50,000 people every year. You're supposed to believe that all this massive consumption, millions of tons of ozone every day, is perfectly safe and poses no threat. But the next time you reach for the can of hairspray, you could just about bring down the end of civilization as we know it. Now, folks, if you accept this, then you probably really do believe that the surf protects us from the ocean, and we should stop the board riders from wearing it away. Now I ask you, just who is kidding who? And why are you falling for it? When are you going to wake up? When are you going to stop believing everything you hear? Remember my admonition? In this day and age, when there are so many deceptions running rampant to destroy the sovereignty of nations and bring about the one world government, you should never believe anyone or anything that you read. You must learn to do productive research and seek the truth. Seek ye the truth, and the truth shall set you free, and nothing else can do it. You are not to believe me. You are not to believe George Bush. You are not to believe Dan Rather. You are not to believe Ted Koppel. You are not to believe your school teacher. You are not to believe your mother, unless you can substantiate it through your own research by finding hard proof. I hope you're capable of doing that, because if you're not, you are in big trouble, bigger than you can even imagine. Much bigger than you can even imagine. Were you aware that they tried this once before, in 1972? Guess what, folks? They had the same meeting in 1972. Just a little different name, but it was all about the same thing. Save the earth, save the planet. In 1972. And guess what the major topic of discussion at that meeting was, folks? Guess what? The major topic was not global warming. It was not the depletion of the ozone layer. It was not about holes in the ozone layer. Nope. It was about global cooling. Global cooling. See, they've tried it before. But the truth is that global cooling is probably closer to the truth than anything else. Because going back through the history of the world, through the geology, you can find that ice ages have occurred on a regular schedule throughout the history of the world. There are regular cycles in nature. And that the warm periods are relatively short compared to the cold periods. And according to the geological scale of time, we are at the end of a warm period, and it should be absolutely natural for cooling to begin to occur. And according to the Agricultural Department of the United States government, this is exactly what has happened. In fact, they've had to replace their agricultural map that shows the regions where you can grow certain crops for the first time in their history. Because for the first time in the history of the Agricultural Department of the United States government, there are areas in the northern hemisphere where certain crops can no longer be grown because it is getting cooler instead of warmer. And the ice caps are not melting as you've been told. I checked with all the control stations throughout the world that measure mean tide levels. And folks, for the last 80 years, again, there's that 80 years. For the last 80 years, the mean tide level of all of those control stations has not changed, not even one fraction of an inch.
A nation or world of people who will not use their intelligence are no better than animals who do not have intelligence. Such people are beasts of burden and stakes on the table by choice and consent. Is that the category that you really want to be in? Good night, folks, and God bless you all.